Retired Cowboy lived alone for years, until 5 Apache widows begged for shelter on his ranch. Jim Callahan had spent most of his life on the wide, sun-baked plains of Arizona. The ranch where he lived had been in his family for generations, and he knew every inch of it. From the dry, dusty trails to the wooden fence posts lined up like soldiers, the land was as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. Yet, for all its beauty, the ranch had grown quieter over the years. The creak of the gate swinging in the wind was now one of the few sounds that reminded Jim of life beyond his own. He had retired from the life of hard labor long ago, though retirement on a ranch like his was never truly a break. Every morning he woke up before the sun, brewed a strong cup of black coffee, and walked the fields to check on the cattle. There was a rhythm to it, a quiet comfort that had kept him going through the years. Sometimes he could hear the distant howl of a coyote or the low moo of a cow calling for its calf, and it reminded him that life, in its simple way, continued despite loneliness. Jim had been married once. His wife, Margaret, had shared every corner of this land with him, and together they had built a life that was modest but full of memories. Margaret had been the kind of woman who could make even the simplest meal feel like a feast and had a laugh that could lift the heaviest hearts. When she passed away, the silence on the ranch became almost unbearable. The house felt too big, the halls echoed with memories, and even the wind seemed to whisper her absence. His children had long since moved away to the city, chasing careers and opportunities that the quiet plains could not offer. Jim understood their choices. He had encouraged them to leave, to see the world beyond the ranch. Still, there were times when he wished they would come back, even if just for a visit. Those visits became fewer and farther between, until the house was once again filled only with the sounds of the wind and the cattle. People in the nearby town saw Jim as a relic of another era. They knew him as the quiet cowboy who kept to himself, a man of few words who had once roamed the plains with his hat low over his eyes and boots caked in dust. Some admired his independence, while others whispered that he was lonely and stubborn. Jim did not mind what people thought. He had learned long ago that life was best measured by what you felt, not by what others said. Despite his solitude, Jim had a certain routine that gave him purpose. He would rise with the sun, check on the cattle, mend fences, and repair equipment. The ranch was old, and things broke easily in the harsh Arizona climate. Yet, each repair brought a sense of accomplishment. He took pride in knowing that he could do everything himself. He was a man who did not rely on anyone, and for many years, that independence had been enough to fill his days. The mornings were his favorite. He would sit on the porch with his coffee, watching the sky turn from dark blue to a warm orange as the sun rose over the mountains. It was a quiet, peaceful time. Birds chirped in the trees, the wind rustled through the tall grasses, and for a few moments, Jim felt a connection to the world that was almost spiritual. It was in these moments that memories of Margaret would surface, sometimes bringing a smile, other times a quiet ache in his chest. Yet not every day was peaceful. The ranch could be unforgiving, especially in the harsh summer months. The heat baked the soil, cattle grew restless, and the wind carried dust that seemed to get into every corner of the house. Jim had learned to adapt. He had faced droughts, storms, and the occasional threat of wildfires. He knew the land could be as cruel as it was beautiful, but he also understood that survival required patience, skill, and a strong heart. Sometimes, Jim would wander down to the small creek that ran through the property. It was not much, just a trickle of water bordered by rocks and sparse vegetation, but it reminded him of life's small blessings. He would watch the water flow, listen to its gentle murmur, and feel a sense of calm wash over him. On these walks, he often thought about the future, wondering if he would spend the rest of his days alone. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. He had friends, though not many. Most of the people he knew were in town, and visits were rare. Occasionally, He would join them at the general store for a cup of coffee and a chat about cattle prices or weather patterns. These moments were brief but meaningful. They reminded him that while he had chosen a life of solitude, human connection still mattered. Jim had learned that a friendly smile or a kind word could make even the loneliest days brighter. Despite his solitary life, Jim had a reputation for kindness. Neighbors knew that if they needed help with a fence, a sick animal, or a broken-down tractor, he would be there without hesitation. It was just who he was. He believed in helping others, even if he did not always enjoy company. There was a quiet strength in being dependable, a trait that had carried him through many hard years. As the years passed, Jim began to notice changes in the surrounding area. Some families had left the plains, seeking better opportunities in the cities. Others struggled to make ends meet. News from town spoke of hardships faced by the local Apache community, families who had lost homes, jobs, or loved ones. Jim did not often concern himself with gossip, but there was something in these stories that stirred a memory deep within him. Memories of times when people helped each other, when communities were strong, and no one was truly alone. One evening, as the sky turned a deep shade of purple and the first stars began to twinkle, Jim sat on his porch reflecting on his life. The ranch was quiet, the only sounds being the distant calls of night birds and the gentle hum of the wind. He thought about his wife, his children, and the life he had built. A sense of longing settled over him, a desire for connection that he could no longer ignore. For the first time in years, he wondered what it would be like to share his home again, to welcome others into his life. Little did Jim know, his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The stories of hardship in town were not just distant news. They were about people who might one day appear on his doorstep, seeking the shelter and kindness that only he could provide. He could not have predicted it, but the quiet ranch, the endless plains, and the life he had built were about to become the backdrop for a story far larger than his own solitude. As night fell, Jim lit a small lamp and sat in the living room, surrounded by memories of a life well lived. He looked out the window at the stars and felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps the next chapter of his life would not be spent alone. Perhaps, after all these years, there were still connections to be made, bonds to be formed, and lives to be touched. The thought was both exciting and daunting, but for the first time in a long while, Jim welcomed it. And so, the stage was set. The retired cowboy who had lived alone for years, unaware that life had more to offer, was about to meet 5 strangers who would challenge his solitude, change his routine, and remind him that even in the quietest corners of the world, there is always room for hope, compassion, and unexpected friendship. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the horizon, painting the desert sky in shades of pink and gold. Jim Callahan had just finished his morning routine, checking on the cattle and repairing a section of broken fence, when he noticed movement at the edge of his property. At first, he thought it might be a neighbor or a wandering traveler, but as he squinted against the sunlight, he saw 5 figures approaching along the dusty trail. They were women, and there was something about their cautious, careful steps that immediately made Jim pause. He instinctively reached for the brim of his hat and stepped closer to the porch, his eyes narrowing as he tried to assess the situation. They were not riding horses or carrying large packs. Instead, they walked slowly, supporting each other as they moved, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and determination. Jim watched them carefully, his instincts as a lifelong cowboy kicking in. He had dealt with strangers before, though rarely on his own property. He knew the importance of caution, but something in their eyes told him that these were not people looking for trouble. They were seeking help, and he could feel it in the way they moved, silently, almost reverently, as if the land itself held some sacred power for them. The women reached the gate, and Jim stepped down from the porch. He cleared his throat, trying to find the words that would both assert his authority and convey a sense of cautious welcome. "Can I help you, ladies?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The tallest of the women stepped forward, a scarf tied loosely around her head, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Please, sir," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "We have nowhere else to go. We are seeking shelter just for a while." There were risks, trust had to be earned, and boundaries had to be set. Yet something in their presence stirred a memory deep within him. He remembered his late wife, Margaret, and the kindness she had always shown to travelers, neighbors, and anyone in need. She had believed that helping others was a duty, not a choice. Jim had admired that about her, and now, faced with the same moral question, he felt a tug at his heart he had not expected. "Come on in," he finally said after a pause. The words felt heavy on his tongue, as if he were stepping into unknown territory, but he knew they were right. "You can stay here for a few days, but we have rules. You work with me and you respect this land." "Agreed." As they walked toward the house, he noticed the way they looked around, taking in the vastness of the ranch, the grazing cattle, the mountains in the distance. They moved with a mixture of awe and caution, as if every step was a reminder that safety was not guaranteed. Jim silently wondered what stories they carried with them, what hardships had driven them to this isolated ranch. Inside the house, he showed them to the spare rooms. The women thanked him quietly, their eyes glimmering with gratitude. They did not speak much at first, but their presence filled the house in a way Jim had not felt in years. The air seemed warmer, and the walls no longer echoed with emptiness. For the first time in a long time, he sensed that life might once again have the sound of laughter, conversation, and shared effort. Over the next few days, Jim observed the women closely. He learned their names, Lena, Marisol, Clara, Yvette, and Anna, and listened as they shared fragments of their pasts. They were widows from the local Apache community, each carrying the weight of loss, yet united by resilience and determination. They had lost homes, family members, and security, and their journey to Jim's ranch had been long and difficult. Yet, despite everything, there was a strength in their eyes that told him they were survivors. Life on the ranch changed immediately. The women adapted quickly, learning the routines of the land and offering help wherever it was needed. Lena showed a talent for cooking over the old wood stove, preparing simple meals that reminded Jim of his own mother's kitchen. Marisol had a way with the animals, calming restless cattle and soothing frightened horses. Clara, Yvette, and Anna helped with mending fences, cleaning barns, and fetching water. Slowly, Jim began to see them not as strangers but as partners in the daily work that defined ranch life. Yet, it was not without challenges. There were moments of tension and misunderstanding, small arguments over chores, and differences in how work should be done. Jim was used to doing things his way, and the women brought their own ideas and traditions. But gradually, these challenges became opportunities for learning. Jim found himself listening more, adapting, and realizing that cooperation could be more rewarding than solitary labor. As the days passed, the bond between Jim and the women deepened. He learned to appreciate their stories, their humor, and their resilience. They shared songs and customs from their culture, and in return, he shared tales of his own life on the ranch. Nights were spent around the fireplace, with the wind howling outside and the warmth of the flames inside, talking quietly, laughing softly, and sometimes simply sitting in comfortable silence. Jim realized that the loneliness he had grown accustomed to was slowly being replaced by a sense of family, even if it was an unusual one. The town, however, did not react as kindly. News of the widows staying on Jim's ranch spread quickly, and while some neighbors admired his compassion, others whispered behind their backs. They questioned his decision, wondering why a man of his age would take on such responsibility, and speculated about the challenges of living with strangers from a different culture. Jim heard the murmurs but chose to ignore them. He had spent his life living by his own principles, and he would not let gossip dictate his actions. One afternoon, a sudden summer storm rolled over the plains. Dark clouds gathered, the wind picked up, and rain began to fall in sheets. The cattle grew restless and the fences creaked under the weight of the storm. Jim and the women worked together, guiding the animals to shelter, securing loose equipment, and ensuring that everyone stayed safe. It was a long, exhausting day, but by the time the storm passed, a sense of accomplishment filled the air. For Jim, it was a moment of realization. These women were not just guests. They were a team, a part of his life, and their presence made the ranch stronger, not weaker. Evenings became a time of reflection. Jim would sit on the porch after the day's work, the women gathered inside the house, and think about how much his life had changed in just a few days. He had spent years in solitude, believing that independence was the most valuable quality a man could have. Now he understood that trust, compassion, and shared effort could bring a richness to life that solitude never could. He felt a sense of gratitude he had not experienced in decades, a feeling that he could not put into words, but that filled his chest with warmth. One night Lena approached him quietly as he watched the stars. "Jim," she said softly, "we are grateful for your kindness. You gave us hope when we had none. It feels right to have company again." As the weeks turned into months, Jim noticed changes in himself he had not expected. He laughed more easily, shared stories more freely, and even allowed himself moments of vulnerability. The widows, in turn, found safety, companionship, and the freedom to rebuild their lives. They respected the land, worked hard, and shared in the responsibilities that came with ranch life. Together, they created a rhythm that balanced work and life, solitude and companionship, struggle and joy. Jim knew that this arrangement would not be easy forever. There would be hardships, disagreements, and challenges that could test their bond. But for now, he welcomed the change. He realized that life, even in its most unexpected forms, could offer redemption and renewal. The widows had entered his life like a storm, at first uncertain and overwhelming, but they had brought with them the promise of warmth, laughter, and a sense of purpose that Jim had long thought lost. The retired cowboy, who had once believed that solitude was his only companion, now understood something profound. Life had a way of bringing people together when they needed each other most. In the quiet moments of the desert plains, surrounded by the sounds of cattle, wind, and distant mountains, Jim felt hope stir in his heart. He was no longer alone, and for the first time in years, he looked forward to tomorrow. Life on the ranch had settled into a new rhythm, though it was far from easy. Jim Callahan, the retired cowboy, had spent decades relying only on himself, and now he shared his days with 5 widows from the Apache community. Each day brought both small victories and new challenges. The women adapted quickly, learning the routines of ranch work, while Jim slowly adapted to their presence in his home and his life. Yet it was clear that building a true sense of family would take more than shared chores. It required trust, understanding, and patience. Some mornings were particularly challenging. Cattle could be unpredictable, especially during the hot afternoons when the sun burned the plains. One day, a frightened cow broke through a weakened section of the fence and bolted toward the ridge. Jim and Marisol ran after it, shouting and waving their arms to calm the animal. The cow was stubborn, skidding over rocks and stirring up clouds of dust, but together they managed to guide it back into the pen. Jim paused for a moment, wiping sweat from his forehead, and realized that he had come to rely on the women's strength and quick thinking. It was a small moment, but it made him feel a sense of pride he had not felt in years. Despite these successes, tension sometimes arose. The widows came from a different culture and way of life, and their approach to work and household routines often differed from Jim's habits. Yvette, for instance, preferred to cook meals in the early morning hours, using herbs and methods unfamiliar to Jim. He was hesitant at first, unsure if it would suit his taste, but gradually he learned to enjoy the flavors, realizing that there was wisdom in their traditions. Lena, who had been the quietest at first, began taking on more responsibilities with the animals. She developed a gentle way of handling the horses, calming them when they were skittish and ensuring that even the youngest calves were properly cared for. Jim watched her closely, sometimes feeling a pang of worry but also admiration. He had learned that strength did not always come from force. It came from patience, care, and understanding. There were also emotional moments that reminded Jim how much life had changed for all of them. Clara shared stories of her late husband and the children she had lost. Anna spoke of the home she had once had, the one destroyed by fire, leaving her with nothing but memories and sorrow. Listening to them, Jim felt a deep sadness, but also a renewed sense of empathy. He realized that hardship did not make people weak. It often made them stronger, more compassionate, and more determined to survive. One evening, after a long day of work in the fields, Jim and the women gathered around the fireplace. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the house felt small but safe against the vastness of the desert. Marisol began sharing a story from her childhood, about a time when her father taught her how to ride horses across the hills. Her voice was soft but confident, carrying memories of courage and resilience. Jim listened, captivated, feeling a connection that went beyond words. Yet there were moments when the past crept in unexpectedly. Jim would sometimes hear the wind through the trees and be reminded of Margaret, his late wife. He would pause in the middle of a task, suddenly overcome with longing and grief. The women noticed these moments and never pressed him for explanation. Instead, they offered quiet companionship, a presence that did not demand words but provided comfort. Slowly, Jim began to understand that grief and healing could coexist with joy and connection. As weeks turned into months, the ranch transformed. It was no longer just a place of solitude. It was a home filled with laughter, shared effort, and mutual respect. The widows brought color and warmth to the house, decorating it with small touches that reminded them of home. Flowers were planted near the porch, handmade quilts covered the beds, and the smell of cooking drifted through the air in ways that Jim had almost forgotten. The ranch, which had once been a place of quiet routine, now pulsed with life. The local town slowly began to notice the changes. Some neighbors still whispered, skeptical of the unusual arrangement, but others came to admire Jim's courage and kindness. When word spread that the widows were contributing to ranch work and learning the ways of the land, curiosity turned into respect. Children from the town would sometimes stop by, watching the women and Jim care for the animals and ask questions about life on the ranch. Jim, who had rarely welcomed visitors before, found himself answering their questions with patience and pride. One day, a challenge arrived that tested both patience and trust. A wildfire broke out near the edge of the property, sending smoke curling into the sky and forcing the cattle to panic. Jim and the women worked together tirelessly, rounding up animals, reinforcing fences, and ensuring that everyone remained safe. It was exhausting, dangerous work, but it forged a bond stronger than any casual acquaintance. By the time the fire was contained, exhaustion weighed heavily on them all, but there was also a profound sense of accomplishment. They had faced adversity together and emerged stronger. In quieter moments, Jim reflected on how much his life had changed. He had spent years believing that solitude was necessary, that independence meant surviving alone. Now he realized that life was richer when shared, even if the sharing came with challenges. He had come to rely on the women not just for help with chores, but for companionship, wisdom, and emotional support. Their presence reminded him that even in the hardest circumstances, human connection could heal wounds and create joy. The women, too, learned from Jim. They learned the rhythms of the land, the changing weather, the habits of the animals, and the practical skills required to manage a ranch. Jim's quiet guidance and patient teaching helped them feel capable, confident, and valued. They respected him not only as a man of experience, but as someone who had opened his heart and home when they had nowhere else to turn. Evenings became times of storytelling, reflection, and shared laughter. The women told tales of their childhood, their families, and the traditions that had shaped their lives. Jim shared memories of his youth, of the days spent with Margaret, and of lessons learned through hard work and perseverance. They discovered that despite their different backgrounds, they shared many values: resilience, compassion, and a deep respect for life and land. There were also tender moments of quiet reflection. Jim would sometimes watch the women working together, sharing stories or preparing meals, and feel a warmth in his chest. He realized that family could take many forms, and that bonds were created not just by blood but by shared effort, trust, and care. He had spent decades living alone, but now he understood that life could still bring unexpected connections that were just as meaningful as those he had lost. Through all the work, laughter, and challenges, the ranch became a place of healing for everyone. The widows found safety and stability, while Jim rediscovered purpose and companionship. They celebrated small victories: the successful birth of a calf, a repaired fence, a harvested crop, and shared in the quiet moments of beauty the desert offered, from sunrises over the mountains to the soft glow of stars at night. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of red and gold, Jim realized that he no longer felt the same emptiness he had carried for so many years. The presence of the women had transformed his life, bringing light, hope, and love back into his home. He knew there would still be challenges ahead, but he felt ready to face them. He had learned that strength was not only measured in solitude and endurance, but in trust, compassion, and the willingness to open one's heart to others. By now, the widows had become an inseparable part of life on the ranch. They laughed together, worked together, and supported each other through moments of difficulty. Jim had learned to lean on them, and they had learned to trust him. Together, they had created a rhythm that balanced hard work with joy, solitude with connection, and grief with healing. The retired cowboy, once a man who believed he could only survive alone, had discovered something extraordinary: a family built not by blood but by choice, shared experience, and unwavering support. The ranch, which had once been a place of quiet solitude, was now alive with the sounds of life, laughter, and connection. Jim knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would not face them alone. And as the night settled over the plains, with the stars shining like diamonds in the sky and the wind whispering through the tall grasses, Jim felt a sense of peace he had not known in years. His life had changed in ways he could never have imagined, all because he had chosen to open his heart and home. The widows had brought not just help, but hope, love, and a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in decades, Jim Callahan understood that life's most valuable treasures were not possessions, land, or even hard-earned independence. They were connection, trust, and the bonds we create with others. The ranch had become more than a home. It had become a sanctuary, a place of learning, love, and growth. And in that quiet desert, amidst the cattle, fences, and rolling plains, a new family had been born. Seasons changed on the ranch, and with each passing month, Jim Callahan noticed how different life had become. The once quiet, lonely property was now full of movement, laughter, and the soft sounds of conversation. The five widows, Lena, Marisol, Clara, Yvette, and Anna, had become an inseparable part of his life, and the ranch had transformed into something far more than land and buildings. It had become a home. The walls, once echoing only the wind, now carried stories, shared meals, and the joy of companionship. Jim had learned that family was not always about blood. Family could be chosen, nurtured, and built with trust and care. Each day brought reminders of this truth. In the mornings, he would rise before the sun to tend the cattle, and the women would join him, carrying water, preparing feed, or guiding the young calves. Together they worked in harmony, understanding the land and animals in ways Jim had long practiced, but now enriched by new perspectives. Their teamwork was seamless, yet every small task reminded him how far they had all come, from strangers, weary and uncertain, to partners who relied on each other fully. Evenings were perhaps the most precious part of their days. After a long day of work, the group would gather around the fireplace or on the porch, sharing stories and laughter. They spoke of lives lost and memories cherished, of struggles endured and lessons learned. Sometimes, silence filled the spaces between words, and yet it was comfortable, a quiet understanding that they were not alone. Jim often found himself reflecting on Margaret, thinking how she would have loved this new family he had formed. He could feel her spirit in the warmth, kindness, and laughter that now filled his home. Life wasn't always easy. There were challenges and disagreements, moments of frustration, and days when exhaustion seemed too heavy to bear. One particularly hot summer, a herd of cattle broke through a weakened fence during a sudden windstorm. Jim, Lena, and Yvette chased after the frightened animals, shouting and guiding them back to safety. The work was exhausting, and by the end of the day they were all sunburned and tired. But in the quiet afterward, sitting on the porch and sipping cool water, Jim felt a deep sense of pride. They had faced difficulties together and had succeeded, and in those shared victories, the bonds between them strengthened. The town began to see Jim and the widows differently. What had once been met with suspicion or gossip now inspired respect and admiration. Neighbors who had whispered behind their backs began visiting the ranch, bringing supplies or stopping for advice on ranch work. Children from the town were curious about the widows and asked questions about their culture, their past, and how they had come to live on the ranch. Jim welcomed them, proud to show how life could be enriched when people came together with trust, respect, and shared purpose. The widows brought life lessons of their own. They shared traditions, songs, and stories that had been passed down through generations. On weekends, they taught Jim small skills from their culture, cooking techniques, storytelling methods, and simple ways to celebrate the cycles of nature. Jim listened intently, appreciating not just the knowledge but the spirit behind it. He realized that he was learning as much from them as they were from him. Together, they created a blend of old cowboy life and Apache traditions, a harmony that made the ranch a unique place where two worlds coexisted beautifully. Jim also noticed how the widows had found healing in the ranch life. Each of them had faced unimaginable loss, of homes, of spouses, of security. But here, amidst the open plains and daily routines, they found purpose and peace. Lena tended to the garden with care, watching tiny seedlings grow into flourishing plants, a quiet reflection of hope and renewal. Clara and Anna worked with the animals, laughing when calves stumbled and celebrating each successful step. Marisol and Yvette took responsibility for the household, keeping the home organized and inviting, their efforts creating comfort and warmth that Jim had not realized he had missed so deeply. Small moments of joy became central to their days. A calf's first steps, a horse learning a new command, the smell of bread baking in the oven, or the first snowflake of winter, all these simple things were celebrated together. Jim, who had once measured life by hard work and survival, now measured it by shared experiences, laughter, and the quiet satisfaction of belonging. He realized that happiness could be found in the simplest acts when shared with those who cared. The widows also helped Jim understand the importance of emotion and vulnerability. He had spent years believing that strength meant facing life alone, without relying on anyone. But now, he saw that opening one's heart, trusting others, and expressing care were also forms of strength. He laughed more freely, shared stories he had once kept locked away, and allowed himself to lean on the women when work became difficult. In return, they offered patience, understanding, and unwavering support, teaching him that family was a network of mutual care and love. As the seasons changed again, winter brought its own challenges. Cold winds swept across the plains, frost covered the early mornings, and snow sometimes blanketed the land in quiet stillness. Together, they tended the cattle, chopped wood for the fireplace, and made sure the house stayed warm. Nights were long but filled with stories, music, and sometimes silent reflection by the fire. The widows' resilience shone during these months, and Jim felt grateful for their presence, recognizing that together they could endure anything. One particularly quiet evening, Jim stepped outside and looked at the stars. He thought about the years he had spent alone, the decades of solitude that had once felt like comfort but had left him empty in ways he hadn't understood. Now, with the widows in his life, the stars seemed brighter, the plains less lonely, and his heart lighter. He realized that life had given him a second chance, not only to share his home, but to be part of a chosen family that valued him as much as he valued them. The widows, too, had grown in confidence and strength. They managed their daily routines with skill and grace, contributed ideas about improving ranch life, and shared laughter and sorrow alike. Each had discovered that while they had lost much in life, they had also gained something unexpected, a place to belong, a chance to rebuild, and a family that embraced them fully. Their presence had not only changed the ranch but had transformed Jim himself. The community began to celebrate this unusual but beautiful household. People saw that the widows were hardworking, respectful, and contributing to ranch life, while Jim's care and guidance created a stable, safe environment for them. Over time, their story became a symbol of compassion, resilience, and the power of human connection. Visitors would occasionally stop by, eager to see how the ranch operated and to witness the harmony that had developed. As the years went on, Jim realized that this new chapter in his life had given him more than he had ever expected. The widows had brought warmth, purpose, and companionship into his home. They had reminded him of the joys of community, the importance of trust, and the beauty of shared life. The ranch was no longer just a place of work. It was a sanctuary, a home filled with love, care, and laughter. Jim often thought about the journey that had brought them together. The widows had arrived desperate, weary, and uncertain, and he had hesitated before opening his gates. Yet, by taking that chance, he had not only helped them survive, but had also allowed himself to experience the richness of life he had long denied. The lessons of trust, kindness, and family had transformed him, and he felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected turn his life had taken. In the evenings, when the work was done and the wind whispered through the trees, Jim would sit on the porch with the women gathered nearby. They would share stories of the day, plans for the future, and reflections on the past. They laughed, reminisced, and sometimes simply sat in silence, feeling the comfort of togetherness. It was in these moments that Jim realized the true meaning of family, not just shared blood, but shared life, love, and effort. The ranch continued to thrive. Cattle were healthy, fences strong, gardens flourishing, and the house filled with warmth and laughter. The widows had made it clear that they were committed not just to surviving, but to living fully, and Jim felt honored to be part of their journey. Together, they faced challenges, celebrated victories, and found joy in the ordinary beauty of everyday life. Jim's reflections often returned to a simple truth: life had a way of surprising even the most solitary hearts. He had thought that his days would be spent alone, tending the land and living with memories. Instead, he had found a family built not by chance, but by compassion, trust, and the willingness to open one's heart. The widows had become more than guests. They were partners, friends, and family, reminding him that life could still bring warmth, connection, and hope, even in the quietest corners of the world. As the sun set on another day, painting the desert sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Jim looked out over the ranch, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded him for decades. The wind rustled through the grasses, the cattle moved calmly in their pens, and the laughter of the widows echoed from the house. For Jim Callahan, the retired cowboy who had once lived a life of quiet solitude, this was more than a home. It was proof that compassion, courage, and the bonds we choose can transform even the loneliest life into one filled with meaning, love, and hope. And in that moment, as the stars began to shine over the vast plains of Arizona, Jim knew that he would never again feel alone. The widows, who had once arrived seeking shelter, had given him something far greater: the gift of family, belonging, and a life renewed. The ranch, and the people who now filled it, had become a living testament to the power of kindness, trust, and the unexpected beauty of human connection.